Welcome back to the last of 6 lessons in 9th grade world history. My name is Coach Spivey, and it's been a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for joining us on this last lesson. Before I get started though, something new today. I will have a question somewhere in this lesson, and if you will email the answer to that question when I prompt you to, you could win some prizes, a t-shirt or a Chick-fil-A gift card. You can email, I'll say it now, you can email that answer to mcpsstv@mcpss.com. And if you email that correct answer, you'll be entered for a chance to win. And I'll bring that information back up in just a second. I want to pick up where we left off last time, which is with our third critical standard to describe causes and consequences of World War II. And where we've gotten so far is we've talked about the causes, and we've almost finished World War II itself. So our focus will be wrapping up World War II and obviously the consequences of World War II. So if we, just as a refresher to kind of remind you of where we were, we remembered that the World War II was fought in both the European theater and the Pacific theater. And where we left off, the Allies had won in Europe. They had the VE, or Victory in Europe Day, and now the Allies, particularly the United States, was able to turn their full undivided attention to fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. And so that's where we'll pick up. The Allies, particularly the United States, had employed their island hopping strategy and were basically on the doorsteps of mainland Japan itself. And so a decision had to be made. What do we do? The Japanese weren't surrendering. They had essentially lost all of their naval fleet. All that was left was a little bit of the Japanese army and the kamikaze pilots. And so how do we do this? The choice was difficult. Do we invade mainland Japan, where it's going to cost a tremendous amount of lives, both the Japanese lives that will be lost in the invasion, but also American and other Allied forces' lives as well? And so what do we do? Well, there was an option on the table, and that option was some new technology of the atomic bomb. And FDR had just passed away in April, and newly installed President Truman had a decision to make. When he became president, he learned of this secret project called the Manhattan Project, where some scientists had developed the atomic bomb, a bomb that would surely cause massive destruction. And so he gave the Japanese one last chance to surrender. He told them to surrender or expect a rain of ruin from the air. And so when the Japanese refused to surrender, in order to expedite the end of World War II, he made the difficult decision to drop the atomic bomb. And so on August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, a city of about 300,000 people. To put that in perspective, it's similar to the size of Mobile. After that bomb was dropped, there was still no surrender. And 3 days later, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Nagasaki, similar size, about 270,000 people. And following those 2 bombs, Japan finally surrendered September the 2nd, 1945. To give you a little perspective, this is the fighting in the Pacific. If I zoom in on mainland Japan itself, here is the Japanese city of Hiroshima down in the southern part, and the Japanese city of Nagasaki. This is the Enola Gay. This is the plane that actually dropped the 2 atomic bombs. This is a photograph of the bomb themselves. This bomb right here is nicknamed Little Boy. little man, and little boy, and this was the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, and then Fat Man dropped on the city of Nagasaki, nicknames for those two bombs. And here's a picture of the mushroom clouds that resulted from the bombs themselves, and a couple of pictures of the destruction that it caused. As you can see, complete and utter destruction in the two cities. Here's just some statistics from the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. Ground temperature 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Can you even fathom 7,000 degrees? Catastrophic winds 980 miles per hour. You know what kind of wind damage a tornado would do at a couple of hundred miles per hour. Any energy release 20,000 tons, 62,000 buildings destroyed. And here's the specific cost to human lives. Look at this. Killed immediately 70,000 people. By the end of the year, in 1945, 140,000 had died, for a total deaths related to a city of 300,000 people. Now, 210,000 were killed, and that's just in Hiroshima. So needless to say, this brought an end to World War II. And so as we turn our attention to the consequences of World War II, and we look here, obviously there's some immediate consequences, but there's also some long-lasting consequences. So we'll definitely get through with these immediate consequences, and then as time permits and allows, we'll look at some of the long-term consequences, some of which still affect us in 2020. And some of the stuff from World War II helps us understand some of the present conflicts and some of the conflicts that we've been in since World War II as well. One thing that I want to mention to start with, and it is a consequence of World War II, one of the most horrific things that happened was what was known as the Holocaust. Now, the definition of Holocaust is destruction or slaughter on a mass scale. But if you ever hear of the Holocaust, most likely you're talking about this destruction or slaughter of the Jewish people during World War II by the Nazi Germans. I told you there'd be a question coming, so I'm going to put it here. You probably already know the answer now, but I'll make sure that we revisit after this little portion of the lesson. So here's your question. What was the mass slaughter of Jews carried out by Nazi Germany during World War II called? And if you know the correct answer, be sure to email your answer to mcpsstv@mcpss.com for your chance to win a t-shirt or Chick-fil-A gift card. So let's return to talking about the Holocaust. Let's set the scene a little bit. First of all, racial superiority. Hitler had promoted through his speeches and his stance this idea of racial superiority, this perfect master Aryan race, which he equated to the German people, were obviously superior and non-Aryans were inferior. And this was all in an effort to kind of create some national pride and us versus them mentality. Well, as a part of that racial superiority, a lot of that prejudice was directed towards Jews. And prejudice towards Jews was not a unique thing to World War II. They had been a long-time target of hatred in Europe throughout the centuries. But this word anti-Semitism is specific. It's prejudice towards Jews, and that's anti-Semitism. And so if you remember some of the things that were going on prior to World War II, we talked about the consequences of World War I and the effects of the worldwide Great Depression. Well, the Jews were an easy scapegoat to a lot of that stuff. They got the blame for a lot of Germany's problems. And so not only were they a target for prejudice, but they also became a target of the government itself, and government policy actually prejudiced towards Jews as well. So now not only people are building this hatred, but the government has certain laws in place that are prejudiced towards Jews. Here's a word that you probably don't know, Kristallnacht. It actually translates to night of broken glass. And this is, if you could pick one event that got this whole Holocaust in motion, this would probably be it. This guy right here, Herschel Grenspan, a young Jewish refugee, assassinated a German official. And the Germans used this as an excuse to launch their attacks on the Jews. And starting on November the 9th, 1938, which was known as the Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht, Nazi soldiers began to attack Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues, which is their places of worship. A couple of photographs of the day after Kristallnacht. So now this Holocaust has begun. So what happened to the Jews? Well, this word immigration, you probably heard of immigration. Immigration, immigration, is when people are coming into a country. Immigration, when people are leaving. So Jews began to leave Germany, some by choice, some by force. And as they began to leave, most of them didn't have any specific place they could go. And a lot of countries began to close their doors. They didn't want a lot of Jews, who some of the neighbors of Germany had anti-Semitic views as well. They began to close their doors to some of these Jews. And then if you think about, as the Jews left, Germany began to conquer lands around them and control more and more areas. And so Jews had fled to areas that now Germany occupied. And so they began to put these Jews in these bad, overcrowded areas of cities called ghettos. And it only gets worse from there. So what do we do with, or if I'm putting myself in the German Nazi position, what to do with our Jewish, quote, problem? So they began what is known as genocide, the systematic killing of an entire group of people. And they set out to get rid of anybody that was considered inferior. Obviously, it was the Jews, but also gypsies, Poles, Russians, homosexuals, disabled, anybody that they considered non-Aryan or inferior. And Jews were hunted down. Those that weren't killed were actually sent to concentration camps or forced labor camps. All these red dots throughout Germany and Poland and some of the border countries are areas where concentration camps or these forced labor camps were. Here's a couple of pictures of these forced labor camps. Obviously conditions overcrowded, harsh. They certainly didn't treat them well, feed them well. Another picture. This was young, old, women, children. It didn't matter. So we still got the issue though. So towards the end of what was called the final solution, they opened up these extermination or death camps. One of the most famous was Auschwitz. And throughout the entire Holocaust, this slaughter of the Jews, about 6 million Jews were killed. All of these little black dots or black diamonds represent these death camps. Auschwitz right here. This is a picture of Auschwitz today. Auschwitz. Here's some stats. I just want to give you a quick look. Jews killed under Nazi rule. I just want you to look at original Jewish population and then the number of Jews killed. In Poland, 3.3 million Jews, 2.8 million killed, only 15% survived. Look at this. If you are a Jew, you are more than likely to be killed during this Holocaust. So once again, your question on the Holocaust, Oh, I apologize. One other thing. Well, what did we do after the war concluded? These Nazi leaders were put on trial for crimes against humanity, and it occurred in Nuremberg, Germany, is known as the Nuremberg Trials. And these 22 Nazi leaders were convicted, and they were either sentenced to life in prison or death. Here's a picture of the Nuremberg Trials. So once again, your question, what was the mass slaughter of Jews carried out by Nazi Germany during World War II called? Again, if you know the answer, email it, mcpsstv@mcpss.com. So we can't skip World War II without talking about the Holocaust. And just so we're clear, this racism wasn't unique to Germany, and it's not unique. We know that there's places, even in the United States, where racism still occurs. And the United States put some Japanese in what they called internment camps. After Pearl Harbor, there's a lot of prejudice towards Japanese and Japanese Americans. And on February 19, 1942, the president issued an executive order, a presidential order, that we're going to round up and put these Japanese Americans into these relocation camps. Here's a couple of the propaganda posters. Obviously, they want to avenge Pearl Harbor. And so there's this distrust and hatred towards Japanese, or even those that look Japanese. Another propaganda poster. Let's blast them Japanazis. And here's a picture of some of the Japanese that were sent to some of these relocation camps here in the United States. So, consequences of World War II. Obviously, the direct cost towards human life, about 60 million were killed or died during World War II. About 20 million of those, or 19.4, were actual soldiers. This 60 million obviously includes the 6 million from the Holocaust. Here's the military that were killed, the civilians that were killed. Obviously, you can see the numbers here. Tremendous loss of life right here in the Soviet Union. Not only was it a huge human cost, but the financial cost of the war itself. Wars are expensive. And then not even in thinking about or including rebuilding in the aftermath of the war. Look at the direct war cost in the billions, which that's expensive even today, but during the 1940s, tremendous, tremendous cost. Consequences. Europe devastated, cities ruined, especially some of the bigger, more important cities were constantly bombed during World War II. The countryside where a lot of the fighting occurred in ruins, farmlands, people displaced as countries began to occupy other places. So you had refugees running for their lives, prisoners of war. What about the concentration camp survivors? All these people were displaced, many with nowhere to go. And then the infrastructure, the destruction of roads and bridges, and obviously the farmland and countryside. Even after World War II was ended, things didn't go back to normal, obviously. And there was a lot of famine that occurred because, one, the farmlands were destroyed, but the ones that were still intact or they could farm, how are you going to get them to places? And then how are people going to even afford to buy those things? And so it took many, many years to get back to normal. Here's a couple of pictures of, I think this is this is Berlin following World War II. This is the city of Paris following World War II. So tremendous, tremendous devastation in Europe. And then in Japan as well, 2 million lives lost. We already looked at what the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki looked like after the bombings of those two cities, and then the ongoing bombing, not atomic bombs, but ongoing bombing of the capital of Tokyo. These cities were left in ruins. So having to try to think about rebuilding some of these. And then not only rebuilding these, but rebuilding the country itself. The United States was forced with the task of doing this, of leading this demilitarization or the rebuilding of Japan. They wanted to get rid of, essentially eliminate their military, and then bring it to a more democratic nation. So they helped Japan set up what was called a constitutional monarchy. A monarchy is a rule by king or queen, but essentially it's a rule by the people under the Constitution. And this monarch, the emperor, is just more of a figurehead, much like the Queen of England. And the U.S. military presence even continues to this day. This is General MacArthur and Emperor Hirohito following World War II. So that's Japan. What about the post-World War, or the post-war world? What did it look like, and how did World War II continue to shape it? And we're going to get as far as we can in this. I want to mention at least a couple of things. First, the nation of Israel. What do we do about the Jews, right? These victims of the Holocaust. Well, the United Nations at the time established what was called this Palestinian Mandate, and they actually gave the Jews a homeland. And on May 14, 1948, Israel officially became a country, given land by the United Nations. Here is a picture of this mandate. Anywhere you see yellow, this is Arab state. Anywhere you see the orange, this is the new nation of Israel. You can see that this is a problem. And not only is it a problem that you're giving land to somebody, but also you got a religious conflict too between the Jews and the Arab Muslims there that even continues to this day. And then the city of Jerusalem itself, which is a holy site to both of those religions, was split as well. So you got the new nation of Israel. There were three countries that emerged as kind of the superpowers: U.S., Great Britain, and Soviet Union, but particularly the U.S. and Soviet Union. And they had different goals. They met at what was called the Yalta Conference. They divided Germany, and they had a bunch of different goals. The United Nations was formed. If you remember, after World War I, they established the League of Nations. This was similar, but this had some backing, some power to it. And it still exists today. They look to provide peace and security, human rights, assistance, obviously any kind of international conflict, try to step in. So as the U.S. and the Soviet Union had different post-war goals, they began to divide up the world, particularly in Europe. And I just want to show you this real quick. The Soviet Union, communist government, began to expand, and this became known as the Iron Curtain, or this curtain between democracy and communism. And U.S. started to implement a policy called containment. Wherever communism showed up, U.S. showed up with their democratic ideas and capitalistic ideas as well. And it instituted what was called the Cold War. And this is where we're in. The Cold War was essentially fighting without actually fighting. We want to fight. We don't want you to win, but we don't really want to fight you. So we start to see the fighting take place in the formation of alliances and the giving of aid. And we're going to try to build up our nuclear arsenal. And we have the space race so that we make sure that one country doesn't get ahead of the other. And it led the United States into other conflicts too, including the Korean War, the Vietnam War, other areas of conflict in Africa and Southeast Asia as well. So these are some of the post-war world consequences of World War II. I know we didn't have time to get into all of them. That's okay. I've really enjoyed my time with you over these past 6 weeks. I hope you learned some stuff about 9th grade world history, and I hope you have a fantastic summer. And don't forget to email the answer to your question to mcpsstv@mcpss.com. Thank you so much.